is a lecturer of English and history at Oxford. He is also a project curator at the National Trust. His research specialises in inclusive histories of the 18th and 19th centuries. And these include histories of people of colour, queer histories, and histories of disability. And we are delighted to welcome you, Tim, and we look forward to hearing your lecture.
Thank you for that introduction too. As exactly as you said, I'm really interested in some of the peoples of the 18th and 19th century who don't often come across as much on the historical record, and just trying to uncover their stories, research their stories, and share their stories. So firstly, I'd just like to start by saying thank you to everyone who's turned up, just for being interested and wanting to hear those stories. And today I'm going to focus on people of colour in Georgian Britain. I'm going to talk about three different topics within that. So one point that I'm going to cover is the general context, and I'll speak in kind of quite general terms about the kind of lifestyles and the kind of statistics and what we know historically about people of colour in Georgian Britain. I'm going to be spending some time looking at a case study, actually, because a lot of historians talk quite generally about people of colour at this time. So what I want to do is actually talk very specifically, and by doing that, I need to kind of zoom in on a specific place or example. So I'm going to use some of my kind of historical research into the city of Bath, and I'm going to use that as an example, as a kind of window into small town experience of people of colour at the time. And lastly, I'm going to kind of bring things back to Kenwood House and just kind of just close up with a few kind of concluding observations. And I guess just one thing that I need to say before we begin is that throughout this talk, I will be using some of the language that people use at the time that obviously we might not choose to use today. So I do just want to kind of flag that up at the beginning. Yeah, that's it. That's all I kind of needed to say to kind of kick us off. So let's dive in. And I guess I want to begin by talking about the wider context and what we know generally about people of colour in Georgian Britain. I am going to be using the term people of colour throughout the talk. Sometimes I will be using the term Black as well, as in Black History Month. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, the reason why sometimes I'll be using the term Black instead of people of colour is that people of colour is a very catch-all term. It kind of refers to people of the global majority, or anyone really who doesn't identify as white or kind of Caucasian. So, and the word Black is very different. It means people who identify specifically with Afro-Caribbean heritage. So there are some times when my comments will apply specifically to people of Afro-Caribbean heritage, in which cases I'll use the term Black. And other times I'll be talking more generally about the non-white population in Georgian Britain. So that's why sometimes I'll be using one term and not the other. So I just thought it'd be helpful to explain that as we begin. And the first point I want to raise really is the fact that the existence of people of colour in Britain is not a recent phenomenon. So people of African descent certainly have lived on the British Isles since at least the time of the Romans. So the first documentary evidence we have of a black man in England references an African legionary who made fun of Emperor Septimus Severus, who was himself of African heritage, and that was in the year 210 AD. So that's thought to be the first known documented instance of a person of colour in Britain. Similarly, we know that there was the first bishop of colour in Britain in the year 690 AD. That's thought to be the first known bishop of colour. That's Bishop Hadrian, who was an African scholar who became the abbot of St. Peter's in Canterbury, which would later become the cathedral. So the fact that actually in Canterbury there was already bishops of colour who was actually sent there by the Pope himself at the time already tells you that there were very different levels of people of colour operating in very different circles in society. So some were kind of at the lower end, but some were at the higher end, even from a very early date. 1240 AD is thought to be the date of the first depiction of a person of colour in a British text. This is the Domesday Book, and you can see the illustration on the screen. So we don't know who that is, but it's the first known depiction of a person of colour in a kind of literary source or in an artistic source. Around that time, we also know that there is at least one person of colour working in the English royal court, and his name is recorded as Johannes Morus, or maybe what we would call John the Moor. So I'm just kind of making the point that there is actually quite a rich heritage of people of colour established even before kind of Tudor or medieval history, let alone the Georgian period. We know that there were so many people of colour active in Tudor Britain that the year 1601 is thought to be the first known British legislation dealing specifically with people of colour. And actually, this was a time when Elizabeth I thought that the communities of colour in Britain had become so numerous that they actually already constituted something of a threat to the British constitution or way of life. So she actually attempted to have an edict written which would evict every person of colour from the British Isles. So the current narratives of immigration problems and etc., the Rwanda regulations and etc., this has happened time and time again. This is actually a long historical pattern. And I want to end the kind of pre-Georgian history, a kind of whip through history, with the year 1616, which is thought to be the first known visual depiction of a named Black individual in Britain. So this is the first instance that we know of a visual depiction of someone who we know exactly who they are and where they lived, and we have some extra documentary evidence about them. And the person you can see in the middle of the screen, his name is John Blank, and we have him recorded in the Westminster Tournament roll, which is a famous illuminated manuscript, and where he's playing a prominent role kind of in a jousting event, actually. And it's, as I say, one of the earliest depictions of a named person of African descent in British history. So although my lecture is really about people of colour in Georgian Britain, I just wanted to start by making the point that Georgian Britain is by no means the first time in British history where people of colour do have lively presence. When we arrive in the Georgian period, very many historians kind of debate how big this presence had grown to, how many people of colour were there in the Georgian period. And the way that we can try and calculate this is we're helped by several contemporary estimates at the time. So actually a lot of people, especially in the 18th century, were already trying to work out how many people of colour were active in Georgian Britain. So for example, in 1765, the Morning Chronicle, which was one of the kind of most successful daily newspapers, asserted that there were over 30,000 Black people in London alone, which is a huge number. So considering at the time, actually, that London had around 700,000 people, if there were indeed 30,000 Black people in London, that's roughly 1 in every 20. So actually, that's a huge number. It's a really significant proportion. It's also fair to say, however, that's one of the larger estimates at the time. So, for example, in the famous Somerset versus Stuart case of 1772, Lord Mansfield of Kenwood House estimated that actually Black residents of London numbered 15,000. So actually, there's a huge amount of variance between estimates like that. So we have to look at all the different estimates that existed at the time and use historical context to try and make our own assumptions about how many there were. What we do know for certain is that even though there was a particularly large Black presence in London, actually people of colour were living all over Britain. So one commentator at the time noted that, quote unquote, in every town and in almost every village are to be seen a little race of, and what he calls mulattoes. So this is the first time I'm going to use some of this contemporary language. But he says that this race of mulattoes was present in every town and in almost every village. Another writer in the Universal magazine in 1762 wrote that encountering people of colour was part of the personal experience of every man in Britain. And he also said that every man who has ever stepped beyond the place of his birth has seen them. So we know for certain that it wasn't just London. There were, or indeed the port cities like Bristol and Liverpool. We can derive from these comments and many similar ones that people of colour were living all over Britain. And the most accurate guess that historians agree with today comes from around the 1760s. And this is the time when the renowned abolitionist Granville Sharp, he estimates the number of all people of colour in England to be around 20,000. And because he was so active in the abolitionist cause and he worked so closely with communities of colour, we think he is one of the most authoritative people to make an accurate estimation. So let's roughly say that in 1760, there were around 20,000 people of colour in England. And as you can imagine, there'll be many more in Scotland and Wales and Ireland and Northern Ireland as well. So who were these people of colour? If there were at least 20,000 of them, and maybe as many as 30,000 of them just in London, who were they and what they were doing? And this is the kind of main chunk of the lecture that I'll spend the most time on, I guess, actually. One of the easiest things that we can say is a very, very large contingent of those were servants or formerly enslaved people or people of colour present in Georgian Britain who were working in some form of domestic service. And often these were brought to Britain by plantation owners or estate owners elsewhere in the world, or by government officials, or by military or naval officers. So these are the most common pathways into Britain at this time. And it's important to note that once in Britain, the life qualities of these servants varied enormously. We do know that a small proportion remained unpaid, so still operated in some ways in a system adjacent to slavery. Some of them worked long hours, some of them were denied basic human rights. We know that some of them even actually wore iron braces around their neck, kind of branded collars, which meant that should they try to run away, their owner's kind of initials would be branded on a collar. So it would be very easy to see that they weren't a free person, as it were. So that's on the kind of more concerning end of the scale. But it's also important to note that a very large proportion of them actually were treated much better than that. So many of them enjoyed indeed a very sumptuous lifestyle. Many of them had much higher levels of education than the white population of the time. And many of them were treated actually more as status symbols than servants. And especially among the higher classes, Black servants were treated as prized possessions and were considered the most fashionable kind of decorative accessory, actually, which in some ways seems quite dehumanizing to us. But it also, in a kind of converse way, ensured that they were treated well. So, for example, they were very commonly decked in very exaggeratedly foreign clothes or very exaggeratedly luxurious clothes. It was very common for servants or companions, as they were often called, to wear a family livery. And it was also a pattern that the darker their complexion, the more exotic and so the more valuable they were perceived to be. So, for some advertisements at the time in the papers, placed by families looking for family help or servants, some of them specifically state that candidates, and I'm quoting here, must be a deep black complexion or have skin that was, and I quote, an excellent fine black. So this was really seen as a kind of status symbol. And indeed, one American visitor was astounded at how expensive and well treated British black servants were. He says, they are considered a great acquisition and much sought for and caressed. An ill dressed or starving Negro is never seen in England. They have not learned to regard Negroes as a degraded class of man as we do in the United States. So, what he's kind of pointing at there is the vast difference between the way that British people treated people of colour compared to people from America at the time, and indeed many of the other Western colonizing states, for example, like Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. So we know for certain that many people of colour who were servants were, on the one hand, objectified in this way. They were kind of their racial identity was seen as a status symbol. But on the other hand, we know for certain that many of them were genuinely cherished and valued as human beings and individuals, as many of them were called companions instead of servants. So, for example, the gentleman on the left is thought to be Francis Barber, who is the companion of Samuel Johnson, Dr. Johnson of the famous dictionary. And Samuel Johnson would not even allow Francis Barber to buy food for his cat, saying that it is not good to employ human beings in the service of animals. So even though technically Samuel Johnson had the right to demand Francis Barber to do anything, he was already making a very clear distinction on what a paid companion should and shouldn't do. And the gentleman on the left, on the right of the screen, is Julius Soubise, and he is one of the most well-known fops of the period, or what people at the time called macaronis. Again, using this quite outdated language, you can see the illustration is entitled a Mungo macaroni. So here we see that one of the most richly dressed and most fashionable figures in high society began life as a black servant to the Duchess of Queensberry. So even though an exceedingly large proportion of people of colour in Georgian Britain were servants, their life quality varied enormously, and it could range from very dehumanizing treatment to very privileged treatment. And in fact, one of the kind of arguments of people who are against the abolition movement was prompted by looking around Britain and commenting how well treated people of colour actually were within the colonial system. So, what about the people of colour in Britain who were not active in domestic service or who were not formally enslaved? There were lots of people who were simply making their own living in kind of everyday life as independent workers or as tradespeople. And many of these, I would go so far as to say most of these, were previously soldiers or sailors. And for this reason, there were a lot more men than women. So the British military at the time offered freedom for enslaved people who joined the army or navy, but then often discharged them from service at the end of whichever conflict they were involved in. And this would mean that they had to find work of their own. They had newly bought freedom, but they wouldn't have a salary anymore. And it means they would end up in the UK without kind of often any connections or a salary, and they'd have to find their own way either by begging in the worst cases or by founding their own businesses, seeking positions in domestic service, etc., etc. And the Navy was particularly active in its recruitment and subsequent dischargement. We know, for example, that black sailors abounded, and there are even records of black naval officers. The person on the left of the screen is a depiction of John Perkins. He's one of the highest ranking people of colour that we know who served in the Navy. And actually, he was captain of his own frigate at one point. So, an enormously senior position. So, you can actually see that racial identity did not stop people from advancing through career progression like a lot of other people. And this ever growing black population finding new work after dischargement from military or naval service included all sorts of people. It included day labourers, it included farmers, teachers, innkeepers, musicians, preachers like John Marrant on the right of the screen, and other professions too innumerable to list. We know that there were black churches, black pubs, and black businesses all across the country. And in London, there are a particular number of these. We know that there are black only concerts, we know that there are black only parties. Historians even think, working from different deductions and references, that there was a black brothel in London. So, despite all these opportunities, I also just want to point out that working life as a person of colour was not easy, however. In 1823, the East India Company introduced new, what they called Asiatic contracts, which were certainly discriminatory, and it meant that Asian and African sailors were subject to much harsher treatment and had much less political rights than their white contemporaries. In London at one point, because there were so many people of colour and it was feared that they were taking over people's jobs, again, a narrative very common to today, it was temporarily illegal, actually, for a person of colour to hold an apprenticeship in trade, although there are many records of black apprentices in other UK cities and regions at the time. Also, crucially, because the legal situation of people of color was very muddled at the time, clearly it was legal to possess and own people of color and other human beings outside of Britain in British colonies. The situation on the British mainland was much more complicated, and the kind of dominant narrative was that if a person was on British soil, they could not technically be enslaved. You could not be a slave if you were on British soil. This is the kind of notion espoused in the song Rule Britannia. You know, Britons never, never will be slaves. But this meant that a lot of people thought that if they could just take a person of colour off the British mainland, the second their kind of foot was off British mainland, they could be monetized and put back into slavery in a way that could not happen on the mainland. So a lot of people were actually tricked or seized or press ganged back into slavery by people who wanted to monetize them. So it was not easy being a person of color in Britain, even though the conditions were so much better than other parts in the world. The other thing I want to mention at this stage is that abolitionist sentiment was exceedingly high from the 1760s and 70s all the way through to the 1830s and beyond. Really, the abolitionist movement was, in my opinion, the first public political movement. It involved and engaged the public in a way that previous political issues had never done. And there was really a national public movement in a really unique way. And abolitionist sentiment was so high that any runaway formerly enslaved people actually attracted much, much more sympathy from the public than they did criticism. So one magistrate actually complained that runaway enslaved people too often found what he called the mob on their side. So he means the public sided with runaway slaves and servants much more than they did with their owners or masters. That same magistrate said it makes it not only difficult but dangerous to the owner or proprietor of slaves to recover the possession of them once they are sported away, when once they have run away. And it was very easy to do so. In big urban centres like London and Liverpool and Bristol are two other big examples. Runaway formerly enslaved people could easily become integrated into Black, what people at the time called ghetto communities. And particularly big in London were those in Whitechapel, Limehouse, and Paddington. And these communities were really large and also crucially self supporting. So people of color had their own financially independent communities in places like this and indeed all around the country. So we have examples, for example, when two black beggars were sent to Bridewell Prison, a debtor's prison in 1773. More than 300 black people not only visited them, but supported them financially. We do know that black beggars were a common sight in cities and towns. And we also know that these seem to have been the subject of particular sympathy. So there are even reports actually that some white beggars at the time blackened their faces as an attempt to increase their takings because people were giving much more sympathy to people of colour who were on the streets. There are two examples on the screen of what are kind of two very famous people who are people of colour and who are begging at this time. Joseph Johnson, the person on the left, you can see that he has this amazing hat on his head. And what he would do is he would knock on your window and then kind of duck beneath the sill, and he would almost kind of he would move his head in such a way that it would look like there was a ship sailing past your window. And then you would kind of send your servant out and give him money. And similarly, Billy Waters was another person in London who was homeless. He was really famous. There wasn't a person in London who did not recognize the name of Billy Waters. And actually, he was so famous that he appeared in plays. There were characters of Billy Waters in plays at the time. And we even know of one occasion where he was so famous that he appeared as himself in a play. And the crowd went wild when not just like an actor depicting him, but he himself turned up on stage. So Joseph Johnson and Billy Waters are both examples of people who were originally in the Navy and then discharged at the end of conflict and had to find their own way in London. There was a specific subscription society in London to support specifically people of colour who were poor or homeless. And importantly, people of colour anywhere in the country were entitled to parish relief as long as they were baptized into the Church of England. So a lot of the records that we have of people of colour from this time come from adult people of colour who became baptized or christened and so were noted by parish records. And that's how we know their names and where they were born or where they were christened, where they married, etc. Many took on Christian names for the occasion, and some are often reflective of their racial heritage, actually. So the most common three or four are Black Man, as in kind of John Blackman. Coal and coffee are used often, and also the term Moor, spelled in various different ways. So my surname, which is also Moor, comes from exactly this reason. So my heritage is Afro-Caribbean, and when my kind of ancestors integrated into the British colonial system, the surname Moor is the one that was given to them, as in the same use, for example, as Othello the Moor, this kind of racialized term. So now I've spoken about people who were servants. I've spoken about people who were not servants, who were either kind of finding their way on the streets, or other people, for example, sailors, John Perkins, or preachers, or all these other wealth of people who were just making an everyday, quite normal living, actually, in Georgian Britain at the time. And I guess the last group of people, before I move on from this section of my talk, the last group of people that I want to mention are those who did really well for themselves. There were many people of colour who flourished and really thrived in Georgian Britain and who actually made it into the highest circles of society. So, for example, one parliamentary report in 1815 reported that a formerly enslaved person had been able to return to the Caribbean with a fortune of £1,500, which in today's money is more than £1 million. We also know of people, for example, like George Africanus and Caesar Picton, who became successful industrialists and entrepreneurs. Others, such as Alauda Equiano and Charles Ignatius Sancho, became hugely respected societal figures. So some we know lots about, others we don't know as much about, but we do know that there were large numbers of people of colour operating in the higher circles of Georgian society. And importantly, these positions of respect were not restricted to men only. So there are many records of people of colour who were women, such as Dido Bell and Mary Sarah Oates, both who I'll come back to in a little bit. For example, they were presiding over the management of mansions or country houses. By 1802, people of colour were so ingrained into high society that the Conservative Hester Thrale complained that, and quote unquote, London society was becoming haunted by black shadows. That's the terminology she uses. She continues to say that there were men of colour in the rank of gentlemen, black ladies covered with finery in the pit at the opera. And another instance that she mentions is tawny children playing in the squares. And then she corrects herself and she says, the gardens of the squares. So the point she's making here, quite horrified, actually, she's horrified by this, is that people of color were not just kind of playing in the corners of streets in a kind of very disheveled fashion, kind of playing with sticks and stones. They were playing in the middle of kind of rich garden squares in Bloomsbury or Mayfair, these kind of private, exclusively owned very expensive garden squares, which they had access to because of family connections and etc. So we know that there were many rich people who operated in the higher circles of society. Some of these actually were originally sons or relatives of African leaders, dignitaries from other countries, such as the people on the screen. These include Ukasor Gronasaur, William Ansah Sasaraku, who is on the left, and the Ayuba Suleiman Duailo on the right of the screen. Sorry for my pronunciation of these. Such figures were sent to England often at the behest and encouragement of merchants or traders. And this was kind of reasoned that the merchants or traders of enslaved people thought that this would conciliate the friendship of leaders of color, for example, African leaders, who were a key stage in the kind of triangular trade infrastructure. They said that if African leaders could send their children to Britain, this would consolidate the leaders' friendship. It would, quote unquote, soften their manners, and it would, quote unquote, add greatly to the security of the traders. So partly this was actually a manipulation to ensure the viability of the slave trade in a time when it was coming under increasing criticism from the British public. However, that definitely worked against the trade of enslaved people and not for them, because the more people of colour that were active in British society, the more their normality and civility and popularity ended up contradicting the very insulting and dehumanizing descriptions of them by their critics. So the more people of colour were active in Georgian Britain, the more inhumane the slavery system appeared, because as some of the people that I quoted earlier mentioned, it was impossible to leave your house almost without encountering people of colour. And the more people encounter people of colour in Georgian Britain, the more human they were realised to be. To us, even just describing this concept seems so controversial and outdated, but this was the political climate that was kind of concurrent at the time. So I've made a lot of generalizations so far in my talk, and now I want to zoom in just quickly to Bath, which I'm going to use as a case study. And partly this is because one of my roles is a project curator for the National Trust portfolio in Bath. I spend a lot of time in particular working at the assembly rooms, which is the slide in the middle. And Bath is a really interesting instance of a place where people of colour are very active. And that's partly because it's got so many links to both London and Bristol, which were two of the biggest port cities. So there's just kind of a few instances that I want to use as case studies or examples to highlight wider truths about the existence of people of colour in Georgian Britain as a whole. So I've been researching people of colour in Georgian Bath for nearly 2 years, and my findings are that Bath actually had one of the most thriving Black communities in Britain at the time. As expected from other places in the country, a large contingent were servants, but many others, like everywhere else, were independent tradespeople or even members of the upper classes. And even though servants of colour generally in the UK were normally well treated, people of colour in Bath in particular were very well treated and are actually cited to be some of the best treated servants in the country. And the reason for this is that Bath, as you probably know, at the time was so associated with with fashion and with being seen and with your kind of respectable public persona. So the better that you were seen to treat your staff, and in particular servants or companions of colour, the better you were respected as an individual. And so the Bath servants, because Bath has a climate where appearances were so important, it was absolutely tantamount that if you were in Bath, your servant was seen to be treated really well, was dressed very well, could speak very well, could prove to have had the highest levels of education, and so on and so forth. So I'll quickly just run through some of these headlines. I've currently identified over 100 named individuals of colour active in Bath at the period. And that's important because I make a rough guess that about 9 in 10 people of colour active at the time would not be present on the historical record. They would not be listed, for example, in the parish records. They would not be named in the newspapers. So if there are at least 100 named individuals of colour who are named in these sources, that almost automatically implies the existence of hundreds and hundreds more who were not. So we can't say exactly how many, but we know that of those 100 named individuals who I have found, more than two-thirds are just in everyday normal working people. Like elsewhere in the country, less than a quarter of those are women, so a lot more are men. And these also include 10 what I call celebrity individuals of colour. There are actually people of colour who are known up and down the country because of their achievements. So Ignatius Sancho and Alauda Equiano, I've already mentioned, they're very prominent society abolitionists. George Bridgetower is a 10-year-old virtuoso violinist. He studies under Haydn in Poland, and then he comes to Bath and he kind of makes his public debut to Britain from Bath and goes on to become famous throughout Europe for his talent. Actually, he's so talented that Beethoven plays with him and goes on to devote a concerto to him, which is said to be one of the hardest things that he wrote because Bridgetower was so talented. And also Ira Aldridge, who was a black celebrity actor, actually probably what we would think of as the first black celebrity actor in the UK, certainly. So these include very well-known, respected people of colour. We also know specifically about the people of colour who were not servants. We know, for example, the Hamlet family were a family of artisans who had a series of studios in Bath. They actually became commissioned by the royal family to do portraits of, for example, Queen Charlotte and the children, and etc. We're also aware of individuals who we don't have portraits of, but we know a lot about their life. So one interesting case is a man called Nathaniel Wells, and he was actually born from a white Welsh slave trader and an enslaved, formerly African woman. And his father actually had many children with his enslaved workers on his family estates. But because Nathaniel Wells was the only male, he actually inherited his father's plantations. So this is a person of color who is exceedingly rich, who lives in Bath, who has a very privileged lifestyle, and yet gets his money and his wealth from the ongoing labor of enslaved people on his plantations. That's really important because you might assume that every person of color in Georgian Britain was necessarily against the slave trade. Whereas actually we're aware of at least some individuals who were profiting equally as much, if not more than, other certain white slave traders who were themselves people of colour. The picture is very complex. This is a picture of Mary Sarah Oates, who in the middle of the 19th century actually becomes to be Lady of the House at Durham Park, which is a huge mansion house just outside of Bath. So we know that Bath was no different to London in that there were very many high profile, rich individuals who were people of colour who were active in Bath society. The last point I just want to make is again talking about servants in particular. We know that Bath had such a thriving black community that actually we have examples like this of a slave advertisement where a runaway has gone missing from London and is just assumed that he's gone to Bath just because there is such a thriving community of black people there who harbour runaway servants. And if you want to know what a bath servant in particular looks like, I've said that they're often better treated than places elsewhere in the country. We have this painting here. You can see that this individual looks really happy and healthy. He's wearing very sumptuous, kind of exaggeratedly foreign clothing. The reason that I think this painting is so important is that this is a rare example of someone who seems to be a servant, but who is on his own in the painting. He is the subject of the portrait. It is not the servant of Lord so and so. He is actually kind of defined as an individual by himself. He is deemed to have enough merit and importance that he is the subject of his own portrait. And this is by the Bath artist William Jones. So by looking at specific case studies, we can find out more about the way that people were treated. And I've just got a few minutes left. So the last thing that I want to talk about is kind of bringing it to Kenwood House in particular. And I just basically want to make that the point that the future is very bright and that there's a lot of potential to do the kind of research that I've been doing in Bath and finding individual examples of people of colour who are active in Bath and in mansion houses like, for example, Durham Park. Um, Similar research is very ripe to be done in Kenwood House. And actually, we are aware of a few individuals of colour who were active, for example, in nearby Hampstead, or do have links to Kenwood House itself. And I'm sure one instance is potentially already known to you. It's the existence of Dido Bell, who is in the painting on the left. And Dido is a really interesting example. She's the daughter of Sir John Lindsay, who is a British naval officer. And her mother is an African woman named Maria Bell, who was almost certainly formerly enslaved, if not continually enslaved. But after her birth, Sir John took Dido to England, and she was raised at Kenwood House by her great uncle, William Murray, the first Earl of Mansfield. And Lord Mansfield is actually one of the people that gave this estimate of how many people of colour there were that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So Dido was brought up in Kenwood House alongside her cousin, Lady Elizabeth Murray, who you can see on the right hand of the painting. And her status while at Kenwood House was it was definitely, she had a very nice lifestyle. She lived in, as you know, such a beautiful house with all the grounds. We don't know her exact status while living in Kenwood House. For example, we know that she managed a certain amount of household affairs. We don't know, for example, to what extent she was considered an employee of the house or whether she was considered a member of the family. Reality is possibly somewhere between the two. For example, we know that she wasn't present at some of the family dinners, but she did come in and talk to the company afterwards. So we're not quite sure kind of the exact nature of her role at Kenwood House, but we do know that she was particularly well treated, that she had a nice life. And you can see in the portrait that, again, she looks very happy and she's actually almost got quite a cheeky, knowing smile on her face. And she looks kind of actually a lot more animated and lively than the more kind of solemn and serene image that we get from Elizabeth Murray. One really interesting link that Kenwood has is this beautiful Van Dyck portrait on the right. This is the portrait of Princess Henrietta of Lorraine. And I guess the last thing I want to do for the talk is just make some comparisons between these two paintings. So they are nearly 150 years apart. So the one, David Murray's painting of Dido and Elizabeth, is in an era where the abolitionist movement is very strong and underway. The country's had the whole of the 18th century where it's getting familiar with the concept of seeing people of colour as an everyday part of normal British life. And so I think we can actually get some clues about that in the different ways that people of colour are depicted in these two portraits. So, for example, you can see that in both portraits, the white patronesses, as it were, are both touching the people of colour. But on the right hand, in Princess Henrietta's case, it's much more of a kind of ownerly way, that she's literally kind of holding her page boy back in some way. Whereas Elizabeth Murray it looks much more like she's reaching out and she's actually almost touching her elbow, as if they were almost kind of suggesting a relationship where they would walk arm in arm or they would touch each other's arms. You can also see that the page boy is literally turned towards Princess Henrietta, whereas Dido Bell is turning away from Elizabeth Murray, as if her whole identity is not merely to facilitate the white person in the painting, but she has an identity of her own. You can also see that in the painting of Princess Henrietta of Lorraine, the page boy is carrying a basket of roses. It's as if he's just been cutting roses for Princess Henrietta and is offering them to him. Offering them to her. And roses, as you know, are a very Western symbol. Kind of roses are very, very much associated, especially with England and Spain. Whereas the basket of fruit that Dido is carrying, so they're both carrying baskets, but Dido is carrying a basket of exotic fruit. It's almost as if by the 1770s, a person of colour doesn't have to be forced into a version of Britishness and present British roses to a master. They can actually be celebrated for their otherness. And as you can see, she's wearing a turban instead of the kind of livery that the page boy is wearing. So her otherness is being celebrated in a way that it is not being objectified as much as the page boy in the right is doing. So these connections that Kenwood House has, actually tell us a lot about the kind of progression in thinking to do with people of colour in Georgian Britain. And I hope I've showed you that actually society, even though there were some really hard challenges for people of colour in Georgian Britain, actually society could be very tolerant and very supportive of the coexistence between people of colour and the white population of Britain at the time. That's what I'm going to say for today. So thank you so much. I really hope that's been useful and interesting, and I hope I've kept the time. So thank you so much.